Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Black Flag Podcast. Joining me today is everyone. We got the great Will Bell, the great Derek, the great Egg Benedict, and then we got Biblical Anarchy, Jacob Winograd, and we got Daniel Hanson, and we got my buddy Anarchist.
What? Oh my gosh.
Sam, you can't do intros anymore. Sam's on.
I'm fired.
Yeah, you're fired from intros, bro.
So, did anyone follow that Crowder ordeal that went on?
Yeah.
As little as possible.
As little as possible?
Yeah.
Were you force-fed that? Or well, you're a big Crowder fan. What did you think of all that?
I honestly, I mean, when it comes to like personal drama like that, it's kind of like I've never really cared about people's personal lives. It's, you know, that I think it's unfortunate that got put out like it did. I actually just heard about it like in the last hour before the show started. So I didn't get to like look at the whole thing, but I just think like anytime it has to do with personal, it gets really dicey when you start making headlines out of it. And it's like, he's going through a divorce. I mean, that sucks.
But what do you think about like him getting a divorce in the sense of, you know, like, does that, I mean, conservatives make a big deal if you get a divorce. Does that lower your perspective of him or anything?
Man, that's a really good question. I've thought about that a lot since he talked about it on Tuesday, I think. And it's really interesting because obviously he is somebody who's always held fast to that conservative, traditional, get married, raise a family. And so it definitely goes against the values on principle, but at the same time, I feel like I understand. I've known people who similar situations have happened to them and they've had no say. I mean, if your spouse decides they want something else and there's basically, and the laws allow for it, there's not a lot you can do. And I mean, I've seen it with friends, and so I probably have a little bit more of a nuanced perspective than some people, but I think that, I don't know. I think it's probably it probably shouldn't really affect how we view him as a public figure. I don't know. I think personal things like that gets dicey.
So Jacob, like, what do you think of biblically? You know, the biblical law that was in the Old Testament. They were pretty strict about marriage and whatnot. Do you think like the United States should emulate that in any way?
No. I mean, you know, so the Bible says that what God has brought together, let no man separate. But I don't believe that God actually brought the United States together. I think so. There is no, you know, principle that it can't be separated, so to speak. So I don't think that would hold. I also completely disagree regarding Stephen Crowder. I think he's a piece of shit. So.
Yeah,
and because it's that divorce was not just in the same way that if America had a national divorce, it's not like a you know, it wouldn't be out of the blue. I mean, just from that clip alone and just the other dramas that have happened with Crowder, he seems to be a very volatile person who and very toxic and verbally abusive. So I mean, and if you're a conservative pundit and you make a living trying to push those values, and you also talk about being a Christian, believing in God and believing in the Bible, and then you treat, I mean, like his wife, like then that clip, his pregnant wife, he's like, go put like berating her about going and giving, I guess, like this medicine or something to like the dogs that's like, you know, would be harmful for a pregnant woman. It's like, I mean, just be a freaking man and do it yourself. Like, fuck. I mean, it's just watching that whole thing. I mean, I liked Crowder years ago, and I never, you know, cared too much about the drama between him and the Daily Wire and whatnot. But that whole thing, just no, I'm sorry. I think he has lost credibility in the eyes of many, and rightfully so.
What's up,
buddy?
Has it been addressed why they only have one car?
Yeah, that's what I thought.
That's also very weird. But honestly, it's not that weird when you consider the patterns of like abusive spouses, like who like to control their wives, or it can go the other way too. You know what I mean? So it's not even a sexist thing. Like,
it's for the environment.
I know
that was plenty loud, Bennett.
I know plenty of men who have been in abusive relationships with their wives. It can go both ways for sure.
Did you know them in the biblical sense?
What does that even mean?
So I would push back a little bit. I would just say, I mean, from that clip, we really don't know. He came out today and said that was an edited clip and it doesn't show all the context, and that he's filed a motion with the courts to be able to talk about everything publicly and that he'll discuss everything publicly. So I'm not saying that makes everything okay, but there's obviously more to the story.
There is no context in my 10 years of marriage where I've ever talked to my wife like that.
So I haven't seen
pregnant.
the video.
There is no context that can make that at all acceptable, especially while your wife is pregnant. I mean, listen, I've had fights with my wife. We've had our share of ups and downs. But
did you hit her? No, I'm just kidding.
No.
I've never chastised my wife and told her, "You need to learn discipline and respect, young lady."
Yeah.
Like, that was really weird.
Well, what bothered me, if they're going through a divorce, they're just heated and they're saying, we don't know what she said before that or like after that. So I can understand that he's just lashing out in a lot of ways, but I will say, like, you can never tell your wife you don't love her. Like, that to me is like, well, I would say more so he's initiating the divorce if you're telling her you don't love her.
He's exhibiting clear, like, very obvious, like, manipulative, controlling behavior, like not wanting to let his wife go and leave and go to the store, and just the way he went about it. I mean, it's just, I'm sorry, there's I mean, other than like the only explanation that could come out would be that it was like some masterfully edited deep fake or something. And other than that, there's really no context that can make it better.
Yeah, I don't need context. Like he said to his wife, "I'm going to fuck you up." Like,
yeah, there's no.
I don't know. Like,
oh, I didn't see that part.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe like whisper in your ear at pillow time, but like, I don't even think that, like, that still sounds scary, especially for a meat and potatoes person like me. But I'm just so happy that, like, so much like that, what was that, like, was it in Texas where like the Libertarian guy and his wheelchair girlfriend or whatever in the riots, he got killed and the driver.
Oh, it's coming back to me a little bit, but
I remember the story, but I don't remember the video.
It split the Libertarians a lot, and like it was just like, much like with Steven Crowder's just whole career and this little thing, I'm just so glad that I've just not cared and stayed and not chosen a side and just, went, oh, I don't even care. Like,
I'm trying. I'm like, I don't want to pay attention to the Steven Crowder thing, but I also just want to pay attention enough to figure out what the psyop is here.
I want to say, I mean, like,
well, dude, it's beautiful watching, conservatives go after each other. I mean, that's my favorite part. What were you going to say, Jacob?
Well, I mean, like, I care insofar as I feel like just people like Steven Crowder have an audience of young men paying attention to them, and if he is a fraud, it's useful to be able to point out the ways in which he is a fraud and to try to point young men towards better role models and figures. And I think Steven Crowder, the comedian, is funny, and I can still appreciate his humor. And I'm not trying to say that there's no path to redemption for him or anything like that. As a Christian, as a the biblical anarchist here, I believe in all that. And I think my prayer is that he seeks help for his issues and that there's a path to reconciliation for him and his spouse. I think that I think nations should get divorced and we should have decentralization. But I do think, marriage, I mean, I don't want the state to tell people they can't get divorced, but I think, culturally it should be something that is shamed. Although I understand, like, if he If he was that verbally abusive and threatening physical abuse, and he was physically abusive, then yeah, I think at the very least, I'm not saying there's no hope in that situation, but you kind of have to remove someone from that situation to keep them from being abused before there can be any hope for some kind of healing to happen. So
Yeah,
anyway, that's my take.
No.
It's just I worry that people are being overly dismissive of it because they value his conservative input, like his voice in the movement. But
Right.
I mean, I just think he's overrated on that stuff too. Like there are better, there are issues with someone like Jordan Peterson, but I think Jordan Peterson's a much better, like if I was going to point young men in a direction, I'd point them to Jordan Peterson a million times before I ever pointed them to someone like Stephen.
So you guys said that Jordan Peterson, or that you said that Crowder had an issue with Daily Wire. I don't really follow all this stuff. I'm not familiar with that. But then you mentioned Jordan Peterson, and he's on the Daily Wire now. So I'm curious because you'd think that Crowder was more conservatively vocal. He would fit the Daily Wire better, in my opinion, than Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, I didn't think that Peterson was a good fit for the Daily Wire, although I understand. I think he did it mostly for the ability to do more projects and have the Daily Wire has a big team of producers and editors and things like that. And so, by the way, one of you's got really bad feedback right now.
Yeah.
We gotta.
I think it's Will.
Me.
Yeah.
Just mute and see what happens.
Yeah, it's Will.
Wow, you sound perfect now, Will.
I'm unmuted now.
Oh,
I'm unmuted.
it stopped.
You just got to mute yourself every 5 minutes for a second.
Maybe you just have to keep
to
talking.
That's been going on for a little bit, and I've been muting myself in and out, trying to figure out if it was me. So I don't
That
know.
is weird.
Well, while Brandon Hanson just joined or came here, I was thinking maybe Derek, you could lead us in some prayer.
Sure. Is Brandon there?
He is.
I'll leave and make room for him.
Oh, stick around.
Buddy's just popping off.
He's just going into. I'll leave and make room for him. He's physically there. Oh, that's funny.
You guys want to do a tradition or a scripted prayer, or just something more?
Am
Just
I?
go, Derek. Go.
Is everyone religious here? All of y'all?
Well, Bennett's in the you're religious, but not in the sense that.
What are you talking about?
Not in the
I don't
sense
know
that.
this Bennett person you're talking about.
Did you just dox him?
I said benefit.
Am I the only hedonist?
Benefit. Big benefit.
That's what I'm
Not
saying.
You have no clue. I invited you to come to mass the other night.
You also criticized me for doing Catholic confirmation.
Only because you don't believe in the Eucharist.
Did this become a conservative podcast? What happened? This is black. I thought we were anarchists and we were waving guns.
Will,
don't wave your gun. Don't wave the gun. We're not getting banned. Don't wave the gun.
Will, what's your perspective on marriage? Since Derek's too chicken to pray.
No, I'll pray. I'm just curious if you guys wanted to do one where we all prayed together that we all knew. We could just do the Our Father.
Sure.
Let's do
I
it
don't know
together.
that one.
We all know it. All right. Who brought us here together? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Will, I liked your prayer.
I'm so
Your prayer was pretty good.
What, we don't finish with the traditional?
Melting in the background. Is making like
So if you don't know, we were just talking about what the Bible has to say about marriage, and then trying to relate it to politics and Stephen Crowder.
I don't know. Like Jordan Peterson got brought up, and I'm just gonna speak from I saw that one recording of his thing where it was him and his wife kind of doing a show. to me, it sounds like he's got a lot of underlying marriage issues that are like fighting on like passive aggressively through the whole thing.
Well, and I saw him live. So Beth and I went to see him live, and Sam, you were there too, in a different row. But we went to see him live, and
Same vibe.
I had Andy, my buddy Andy, went as well. Like, and there's other people I knew that went. A bunch of people went, but not necessarily together. But went, and it was ironic that it was before my wife and I got married. We were engaged. We didn't know what the topic was. He was just going to talk about his new book, and the whole speech was about dating and like coupleships and relationships and stuff, right? And his wife opened for him, and then he went on, and then afterwards they sat together and answered questions from the crowd, and it was actually like really good. Like they were talking about the issues that they had together, but they were like talking about how they work through them. So it was, I don't know if maybe he was just in a weird funk, but I also feel like, so when I first saw, this is kind of going back to when I first saw,
Stop it.
when I first saw that that Jordan Peterson was joining the Daily Wire, my immediate reaction wasn't excitement; it was fear. So I was like, I am worried because he's been pushing back on the left since I first stumbled upon him years ago, and I was like, I hope that he's not moving into the tyrannical right. I was like, if he's hanging out with all of those guys, they talk a lot about like the state enforcing values. And so I was just hoping that when he started working there, I was like, now he's going to be surrounded by people talking like that. And that no matter how strong your fortitude is on something, like when you're surrounded by fairly intelligent, I mean, we can debate about whether or not Matt Walsh is intelligent, but when you're surrounded by fairly intelligent people that have political opinions like that, it's going to be difficult to resist that influence.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a mixed bag, his time there. I think he's actually not moved too far, like, towards the reactionary right-wing stuff as he could have when he joined, when it comes to, like, the culture war stuff. He's definitely he's gotten, I don't know, like, on some things he's been good related to foreign policy. Like, he's really good on Russia and Ukraine. But then he's had, like, some really just god-awful takes on, like, Iran and some other things as well. So, I don't know. I mean, he should really just stay in his lane. He's not a foreign policy guy. He's not Scott Horton. You know, and he's at his best when he's relating religion to culture and talking about psychology and Jungian archetypes and things like that. So I think he's, you know, I mean, and the reason I brought him up was I was like, you know, I don't think Jordan Peterson's perfect. I have complaints about him. I have disagreements with him, but I would point someone to him way before I pointed them to Steven Crowder. Was my only point. And every interaction I've seen between him and his wife has been, I think, normal. I don't know how many of us here are married, but I mean, if you're in a marriage and in a good one, you know, it's not, you know, like a marriage should not be contentious to the point where you're like both, like, you know, where one or both of you is like abusing one another. But you also, like, a good marriage doesn't mean tranquility or like passiveness. Like, you know, your partner should be someone who challenges you, and you know, that can sometimes be contentious, and that can sometimes, you know, mean that you do have, you know, issues that you have to work through. I mean, it's naive to think you're going to get married to someone, spend 50, 60 years with each other, and not have difficult times and ups and downs. But, you know, marriage is much more about the commitment to work through those times and to grow with each other through all those different phases. And it seems like, you know, Jordan and his wife have done a good job of that.
Well, we actually took something from his speech and integrated into our wedding ceremony. So a lot of times you'll see they'll have like people do like they dump sand together, or they do paintings together, or they light a candle together, or whatever. There's like a little side ceremony during the ceremony. You know what I'm talking about?
The unity ceremony.
Yeah. And so like we took one from his that I didn't really look. I tried to find the actual like culture that he was referencing, but he went to some wedding where he saw two people were holding a candle above their head, and making a commitment that they were both committed to the light above them, which represented Christ. And so it's like they were committed to each other, but more importantly, committed to Christ above them, like symbolically. So we kind of integrated that into our wedding ceremony, where we put a candle above and we put our hands on there. And then I took something that he had written and copy pasted it and then like edited the crap out of it until it was more like more from me, and it was more directly biblical instead of just symbolically biblical, because his was kind of explaining the symbolism of it, and I made mine more like, you know, Christ and Yeshua, and using those kinds of terms like that throughout it. And I thought that was kind of a cool spiel that he went on, where you have to have a guiding light and a principle above each other, so that, you know, one person serves one person or one person submits to the other. There's these like kind of perspectives on all that. But his point was that if you put Christ above that, then you're both seeking towards the same thing. And I think that things work out that way.
Oh, man, that was
All right, we need to hear from our resident heathen. He's been very
I'm sitting
quiet.
there going, why am I here, fellas?
You're supposed to be our Reddit atheist. We need we have a Reddit. We got a Lutheran here, and then
What's your?
Jacob,
I want to hear Will's opinion. Well, Sam, you can ask your question, but I want to hear Will's opinion on marriage, and what he thinks of, especially of like Christian and biblical principles relating to marriage.
Jacob or Will's kind of like when you're watching like CNN and they have like the token Republican that they can all gang up on. You know what I'm saying?
I thought you were going to say
that's exactly what it is.
Side.
So wait. Will is our Meghan McCain, and this is if we were the View.
Yeah.
Soft.
Is our goal to make Will cry by the end of this episode, so we can screenshot that and share it all over Twitter.
Yo, Will hail Satan. Come on.
We do need a crying Will meme.
It just depends on if we get to that third bottle of wine or not.
Right.
We've never hit that. We've hit the 2 bottle, and that was a mistake.
Well, this might be a 2-bottle episode for you.
He starts like carving a pentagram in his chest.
I about did. When y'all were praying, I almost went into some sort of satanic chant.
Does anyone here know Latin? We can start reciting the Latin mass. Maybe Will will start like blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
Sounds like
Jacob, what you asking about the like my opinion on like when you say like Christian principles in reference to like marriage? What you get?
The idea that like do you think? Like, what do you think marriage should be, and what do you think about people divorcing and whatnot? And what do you think of the Christian perspective, which is generally that like frowns upon divorce and thinks that it's either like you have a spectrum, right? Like some Christians are like no divorce ever, and they're even to the point like if someone's abusing the spouse, they're like, no, you can't leave your spouse. And I don't agree with that. You know, I'm on probably the softer end of things, where it's like I think sometimes divorce is like a necessary evil, but I think it should be culturally, stigmatized to a point where it's like you should be careful about who you get married to, and fight as much as you can to make that marriage work. So that's what I think based on what the Bible says. But I want to hear what your perspective is on marriage and what the biblical view of marriage is.
I mean, I think marriage can be a beautiful thing. I think when 2 people want to merge their lives together, it's kind of like what most people kind of strive to find, you know what I mean? Like finding life. But I do like when we get into this conservative kind of Christian thinking of just, I don't know. I mean, like obviously like people, it shouldn't be willy-nilly, like you just are able to unite your lives in and out. But I think it kind of works best there when it's like you need to prove your love to each other and kind of maintain that. And when things go awry, sometimes it's best for people to separate their lives. Now when you bring children into it, it becomes harder, but I think society's for the best when people have like their options to like come and go as they please in relationships like a marriage. Obviously, the goal is always to like, you know, find somebody and be there forever, but you never know, you know, what life's gonna swing at you and stuff.
Do you think
So
polygamous
would a libertarian
marriages are on the same
clause in that contract?
That's a good question to bring in the libertarian contract.
Like, yeah, the principles of contracts, and you know, you need to have an exit clause in there. If
clawback clause,
clawback, you know,
you now owe me $14,000.
We should hear from Brandon. I don't know if you got any thoughts on marriage and.
Oh boy. Well, first of all, I apologize for showing up here late.
No, it's an anarchist podcast. It's totally normal.
Oh, it's totally normal to show up late. Well,
It is, yeah.
It was not my intention to disrespect all your guys' time like that. But shoot, I mean, I kind of missed out on the first part of this, so I don't really know where you guys have been going with it.
We haven't been wherever you're going.
Wherever I'm going. Regarding marriage.
Let's put it this way. How does the biblical marriage and the political marriage, like, are those different, or should they be different? Or, I mean, you look at the Old Testament, if you got a divorce, it was just once. And, you know, I know like people like Steven Crowder say, well, it should be illegal to have divorces and stuff like that.
He says it should be illegal?
He seems to imply that.
Okay, interesting.
Really?
Well, that's really interesting considering the recent news. But
he always says, well, she wants to divorce me, and it's not against the law. Like, the law doesn't stop her from doing that. So yeah. I feel like that's what he's hinting towards, is there should be law. And I've heard this before. Someone said if it was easy to legally get a divorce, she would have gotten a divorce before, and she's glad she didn't because she's still married. Which I thought was really weird, but
sure. I mean, yeah, from a Judeo-Christian perspective anyway, marriage has, you know, it's been there since the beginning. Talks about it in Scripture. Christ references back to the man becoming one with the woman. The two shall become one, stuff like that. From my perspective, it is both a societal thing, a political thing, because we live in society. Should the two be separate? I think that Christian marriage should be considered something different than the license that you sign. I don't think that, you know, I've married people without a license before. It's perfectly legal. They don't require a license for two people to say, hey, outside of the government and their oversight, we're going to, you know, sign a private contract, and we don't want the government involved. Fine, I'll do that. In fact, I prefer it that way because as a Lutheran pastor, I don't want to have to be held accountable to marry certain types of, relationships, if you would. It just goes against my beliefs. And so I don't, it's like offering services. I don't offer services freely. So anyway.
Are you alluding to gay marriage?
I would be alluding to that amongst others. Yeah.
What else would you be what else are you?
Polygamy?
There's a number of things that have, it's, I mean, do you want me to get into it? Is that what you're asking me to?
Part of marriage in the terms of like this private contract, setting up like an LLC.
Yeah.
You know, just
Beth and I seriously contemplated not doing it like with a legal license.
Yeah.
And we just came to the conclusion that it's like, by the time we figure out all the details with a lawyer to what it would be, it's just like the last hurdle is just having it acknowledged by the state. You know, it's like, and I don't really care about that, but it was almost just like,
that's only because there is like the societal like things, like the tax side of it, the like succession of death stuff, life insurance. You can have any
medical death decisions,
certain things like that. That society created under that construct.
Hey, Bennett, what is up with your guys' audio? that is making a bunch of weird noises over there, and you just cut out and got soft.
Really?
I don't know.
Yeah. Is it
It's back now.
is it good now?
It's good now.
Yeah, but now we hear the background room noise. But it
Oh,
is
weird.
what it is.
Like
Yeah,
the
so-
like a ringing?
It's like you're in a coffee shop. Okay, now it sounds better. Probably muted. So let me ask you guys this. So since both Brandon and Jacob are here, I don't know if you guys' opinions are the same, but what do you think do you think you can be a biblical anarchist? And so Jacob, kind of explain how you can be an anarchist and why you think it's biblical, and then maybe talk to Brandon.
Okay, well, I can try to do this quickly. I mean, it's not like it wouldn't be best explained usually in like a quick answer, but I think the basic summary is that the Bible teaches certain things about government and authority, and I do think that if we take all those things and we try to apply them consistently, with Scripture and the example that Christ gave us, that we essentially have views that God has prescribed civil authorities to administer civil justice, but that those civil authorities their authority is necessarily limited, and that they cannot use that authority to tyrannize people who are not violating the rights of others. And so essentially that leads to libertarianism, and I think anarchism is the consistent expression or form of libertarianism, but basically that those who serve in the role of government have the same rights as those that they are governing, and so they cannot obtain their authority through coercion or through the initiation of force. And if we are doing a critical analysis of the state, both philosophically and politically, and also biblically, because I think there's a lot of biblical support for this as well, the state is fundamentally an entity of coercion that derives its authority not through legitimate market, voluntary or biblical means, but through violence and the threat of violence. And also, I think that to add a biblical element into this, there is a lot of evidence in the Bible for the state, for the kingdoms of man, being both idolatrous and under the influence and control, to some degree at least, of Satan. So that's kind of the summary version. We can definitely go into different parts of that, if you want, but I don't want to, ramble on for too long. So I think that's a good summary.
Well, and I think marriage is actually one of the greatest examples of explaining the state's illegitimacy to people. It's like this is something that was happening before states, before the way that we think of governments nowadays ever existed. People were committing themselves to each other before their community,
Trading each other for like livestock and
before the and I can get into some of those old traditional things too that are often seen as, like, I could go off about that stuff, that are often seen as like
Alliances.
they're seen as like sexist and using women and all that stuff. It's like there's a lot of stuff that goes back there that's actually you could argue, because we're ignorant and we just assume it's bad, but you could actually argue hypothetically how it was protecting women.
Also, like, gave women a certain amount of power that only a woman could have.
I would actually go further than that, Derek, and I would say that it's more than hypothetical. When you look at the ancient world, it was very barbaric. Before the implementation of the Torah, the five first books of the Bible, before the implementation of the Torah, the ancient world was very brutal. So all the laws, like, we often look like an eye for an eye and we think, well, that's brutal. Well, in the ancient world, somebody takes out your eye and you kill them. Somebody
Well,
Their
kills your
entire
brother.
family. You take out their entire family.
Yeah, exactly. Somebody kills your brother, you kill their family, you kill the whole
Well,
tribe. And so it
people
was
have
putting a
said, too, they're like-
maximum was putting maximum punishments. It was saying barbarity needs to be ended. We're going to go to a civilized society.
Exactly.
I will add to that and say too, like people have brought up to me, like there's a section where it talks about stoning a woman, right? And people are like, oh, this is so barbaric. The Bible says that it's okay to stone a woman. And it's like, what they were doing was they were adding a rule saying you have to have witnesses.
Was it a
Right.
light?
Prior to that, there was, it was a light stoning.
Was it a light?
That's the same. That's the
I had
same
to
with
go to
like
30
stoning.
minutes of Taliban school to learn how to light stone.
Oh my God.
There's actually there's no historical evidence that a stoning has ever taken place in Jewish history. That is a notable fact about that. So that was implemented as the maximum punishment, but there's no historical fact that ever took place.
And my point is, at the time, that was progressive, quote unquote. It was like, hey,
Exactly.
we should make sure that if we're going to kill a woman, that there's a witness. It wasn't saying, oh, hey, we're going to kill women now. It was like, we were already doing that. We're actually going to make a rule that says there should be a witness. So it's like, I think when people look at the Old Testament, they think, oh, that's so barbaric. It's like, yeah,
But
compared to the times now.
They were barbarians.
We don't expect the Bible to just be progressive or even better than previous times. We expect the Bible to be the absolute truth. So
I mean, maybe the
Brandon.
stoning, I agree with Daniel on like not having any like record of a stoning, but like the nature of like the kind of execution that a stoning would be, to me, seems like just something a mob of angry people would do, and it wouldn't be like, like whoever's in charge, like, okay, we're gonna come out here at 3:00,
right, and stone.
An important element of this.
The Torah actually put in very strict rules, so it wasn't a mob. That was the point. You had to go before the high priest, and you had to present your case with a witness. And so, therefore, all of a sudden, all these illegal stonings had to end because now you had an arbiter of justice.
Right.
And so it actually instituted justice.
Well,
right.
Okay.
And
I want to give
insofar
Brandon
as
a chance. Sorry, I want to give Brandon a chance to jump in here for a bit. So, what do you think the role? Well, you can add on to that, but also just what do you think the role of politics in the Bible? Can we have biblical anarchy?
Well, the concept of biblical anarchy is a little new to me, I must admit. I've probably known about it for a year, and I've only been looking into it for about a month. So I'm not going to say I don't have opinions about it, but I would say I've got more questions than I feel like I would. It would be irresponsible of me to weigh in right now and say, "Thus saith the Lord." Here are the scripture passages, because I've listened to quite a bit, I've read a bit, and I've still got questions. It seems a little unclear. Now, your explanation here just a few minutes ago there was pretty good. I thought that was really good for a 2.5 or 3 minute explanation. Excellent. You kind of hit all the things that all at once there in a 30,000 foot overview. So I do have questions. I don't know if this is the show to jump into them regarding particular passages that so I don't know if we want to dive into a particular passage.
It's a Bible podcast.
Okay.
Go for it.
All right. Yeah. So of interest to me in particular are the interpretations of a couple different passages here.
Is one of them Romans 13?
Yeah, it is Romans 13.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Look at my avatar.
Look, he's got a my Romans 13.
Yeah. Nice.
Instead of my roads, it's my Romans 13.
So I think too, like if we're gonna kind of go into this, because I think a lot of us have probably thought about this extensively.
I'm Catholic. I don't look at the Bible.
I actually signed up.
I was going to say Derek, that guy yesterday.
Yeah. Daniel was with me. We signed up a guy who was Catholic, an old guy, and he was like, "Well, I'm Catholic, so I never really read the Bible." So I'm watching this show called The Chosen.
Oh gosh.
Very accurate.
Instead of reading the Bible, he's like, I'm gonna watch this show before I go to Jerusalem. He was genuine. He's like, that way it's gonna be more meaningful for me.
Oh,
I saw
bless his heart.
them filming. I saw like this behind the scenes filming the walking on water scene the other day.
Uh-huh.
Looks pretty good.
Nice.
All right,
Yeah,
I got
I don't-
Romans 13 pulled up if we want to go into it.
We
All right.
know. We know.
We totally are.
I'm fucking with that.
Well, I
So-
mean, my big question
So,
is
Will, the Romans were a culture from approximately 300 BC to 600 BC.
Wait, they weren't. I thought they were Romans, like they were like boat.
Oh yeah,
Have you ever
wait. Okay, so
They
here's
just
my,
came up to speed a little bit.
have you ever heard of Derek Chauvin? Picture like 20,000 of those, and then you got the Romans.
That's pretty accurate, actually.
is like
Daniel,
basically the
I
Nazis
think-
if the Holocaust happened.
Yeah. I'll give you that one, Derek.
Thanks, buddy.
What, did Jesus say, "I cannot breathe" on the cross?
Oh my god.
Okay. we got our.
Jacob,
We
I
got
don't
our.
like when you did blasphemy.
Did
I know
Jesus
you don't.
use it?
It
did
just
Jesus
throws
try
me
and
off.
pay-
Makes
You're-
me feel
you-
like I should-
You
All
are
right.
not fulfilling your duty, Will. So I have to step in.
Y'all hit me. Y'all put me in a fucking different vibration when y'all hit me with the prayer in the beginning of this. That's
All right.
It was to the spaghetti monster, Will. It's okay.
Okay. All right. We can go on.
Can't the spaghetti monster can't hurt you, Will.
All right.
Well,
Well, let me just throw my perspective out. It's like the Bible. I mean, they specifically at one point God installed a king, so we know God believes in government. I know it wasn't his first idea, but even before then, they had judges.
Or just a king said that. He's like, no, God made me king, and he makes me a better king.
Well, and we have the law and the gospel, and all of the laws. It's not it is the law. It's the physical law of what people had to do, especially in the Old Testament. So, I think a lot of conservatives think, well, that's kind of how America should be. We should have a lot of those same laws. And even if you read the New Testament,
So is the question that you're trying to get to with Brandon here, is the question that you're trying to get him to answer, I guess, to make it more of a pointed question is, should libertarian principles, or can libertarian principles and biblical morality basically be played out in society without government enforcement, or is your question that, or should we have the government enforce biblical morals? Is that kind of what you're getting at? Because I guess your question seems kind of vague when you're asking.
that is my question. Yes.
well, I
Okay.
think part of the problem here is not. Oh my god, that's part of the problem. I gotta get that phrase out of my vernacular. But the issue is that I think there's a conflation between government and the state, and we sometimes use those terms synonymously, and I don't think that's helpful. I understand why colloquially or just semantically sometimes we do that. It's kind of like when we refer to the government as we or us, and I try to get out of doing that as much as I can too, because I don't believe in that mantra that we are the government. But yeah, I think that government or governance or governing, that is like a function. It's like a service. It's a role that people can fill in a society. I think the state is a form of government, but it's not necessarily the only form of governance that can exist.
True.
So, I think that's an important thing to throw out there as well. Because, and that's going to play into Romans 13, because Romans 13 starts out by saying, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. And in the Greek, it's the higher powers, or the hyper exousia, if I'm remembering correctly. So, yes, David Brady, we're doing Romans 13. Yeah. So, when God, and we have to read this in context, right? Because when the book of Romans was written, it was a letter, and they didn't have the chapter subdivision. So we have to understand, where Paul is at in the letter. Well, right before this section we call Romans 13, there's Romans 12 ends with Paul sort of echoing Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount, saying that, do not return evil for evil, but overcome evil with good. And he says, do not seek vengeance against the one who wrongs you, for the Lord says, vengeance belongs to me. Now, the way Paul writes in all of his writings, and a lot of times in Romans, is that like he'll say something and then he sort of like predicts what the objections are going to be to what he's saying, and then answers objections or questions that are going to be raised. So a natural question that's going to be raised sort of like in the end of Romans 12 is like, well, hold on. So you're saying that when people persecute us, when people do evil against us, we're not to resist them, we're not to fight back, we're supposed to overcome evil with good. What does that look like? If vengeance belongs to God, are we supposed to just let evil people run amok and just do whatever they want and just roll over and live in a lawless society? And so Paul's like, well, no, we everyone should be subject to the governing authorities, for it says that, there is no authority except that which comes from God, and that people in authority have been instituted by God. We have to then, understand what the biblical view of authority is. And authority comes in different forms, right? Like, within marriage and a family unit, you have different overlaying levels of authority. Like my wife has a level of authority into my life, and I have a level of authority over her life. We have authority over our kids. So, those are types of authority. There's also authority that exists within a church. So like my pastor has a measure of authority over my life and my family's life, and over the functions of the church. Teachers have authority to a certain extent over their students. An employer or an owner of a business has authority over his employees and those he has contracted. But in all of these different examples, those authorities are necessarily limited, and they're limited multidimensionally. They're limited in terms of their power, and they're limited in terms of their scope. So there's this idea, and it actually comes, I think it's biblical, but the label for this idea comes from the Dutch reformers, and it's the idea of sphere sovereignty. And it's the idea that, authority exists in these different spheres, and that it's a violation of those authorities if they go into areas that are not for them, that's not been delegated to God for them. So an example that I like to use is that, let's say, a teacher has been delegated some measure of authority over a student, right? And it can be like, well, I'm going to assign homework to you. I'm going to say you have to take a test. I'm going to say you need to be, show up to class on time. But the minute that teacher tries to enter into the sphere that belongs to like parents and says, oh, you need to go to bed at 9 o'clock. Oh, you need to brush your teeth 4 times a day. Oh, you can't eat pizza anymore. Or you can't watch this kind of movie. That is a abuse of authority on the part of the teacher. And so that's a type of violation of authority that's like, going into areas that you've not been delegated, that your authority has not been, prescribed to go into. And then there's, of course, a violation of authority or abuse of authority when it comes to like, just actual like abuse or tyranny. If you initiate force against someone who is peaceful based on that authority. Like my pastor has authority over me in terms of like just that normal relationship that that exists within a church. But like, if my pastor were to come in to strike me, that wouldn't be justified just because he has a position of authority over me. Or like I have authority over my wife. This relates back to the conversation about Crowder earlier, but that authority doesn't grant me the right to abuse her, or, I don't believe we have the right to abuse our kids just because we have authority over them. So understanding what biblical authority is necessary for reading something like Romans 13. Because, yes, there are people who are supposed to exercise and administer civil governance. Like the Bible believes, and we believe, I think even libertarians, we believe in rules. We believe in property rights. We believe that if you violate someone's property rights, meaning like if you violate their self-ownership by aggressing against them, or you violate contract, or you steal, or you commit fraud, or you violate property rights to any degree, that there needs to be some kind of response to that to rectify that situation. We don't want people just running around violating each other's rights. So that's what Paul's talking about here. But what he's saying is that, A, you shouldn't take like personal vengeance into your own hands. So what he's saying is like, listen, if someone wrongs you, don't like seek revenge against them. Don't go burn down their house. Don't go, try to, you don't live eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Forgive them, show them mercy. And then these kind of problems should get sorted out by like a third party arbiter, those who are acting in the role of civil governance to solve the problem if it's a problem that needs to be arbitrated in some way. And
okay, so
one final thing here. One of the most important lines in this section of Romans 13 is in verse 3, where it says, "For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval, for he is God's servant for your good." You cannot really make that apply to the state, both historically and just on like a political analysis of what the state is fundamentally and philosophically speaking. The state exists by violating property rights, and every state that exists is a terror to people doing good. I mean, even the Roman government was a terror to the early church and to Christians. Like 2 years after Paul writes this, he's in jail. So
Do you think he was not referring to the Roman government when he wrote this?
No, I think, to summarize, I think that Romans 13 is not describing the Roman government. I think Romans 13 is prescribing the godly norms, the biblical norms for civil governance and for those who are going to administer civil justice. And now, insofar as if there were times that the Roman government would fulfill that godly ordinance, and like let's say like a Roman government officer like caught a thief and made him pay restitution, that he would be completely in line with the text of Romans 13 and with what the Bible teaches about government and civil justice.
Yeah.
But when they're doing other things like initiating coercive taxation, or they are persecuting Christians for worshiping God, they are clearly not, and I think most Christians, even non-Christian anarchists, would hopefully agree that like we're not if the SS comes and tells us that we need to round up the Jews to get sent to the concentration camps, we don't have to listen to that. And so we already know that there is an area where civil authorities go too far, and biblical anarchy or Christian anarchism is essentially saying that if we take biblical principles consistently, if we say it's wrong, if it's wrong to steal and it's wrong to murder, there's nowhere in the Bible that it says, well, unless you're a cop, or unless you're a governor, or unless you're a king. Like nowhere in the Bible does it say suddenly it's okay for those people to initiate force against others, and nowhere in the Bible does it say that we should that authorities
like in the Old Testament, like doesn't it just like God tell them like, hey, go slaughter that other tribe, they're worshiping some golden calf or something.
There's a lot that we'd have to go into. I mean, for one, there is a sort of like ecclesiastical there's a eschatological intrusion that happens during the conquest of Canaan. But that is necessarily ended. Like those were commands that were given to Israel specifically in a limited time during that covenant. And it wasn't like in a vacuum. Like the Canaanite people were, by all biblical and archaeological evidence, like evil, like incredibly evil. And so God was using Israel.
Every man, woman, and child was evil, if I remember right.
So
well, it's important to note that Israel never actually went and killed every single man, woman, and child of the Canaanites. So
right.
So about 5 minutes ago, I said I was going to chime in, and you said one more thing. So
and then we got to let Brandon chime in.
Well, what I'm trying to do is, because Jacob's going super detailed into the philosophy of the libertarian argument from a biblical perspective, which I appreciate, and I think more people need to hear that. But what I'm curious as like someone who's Brandon, who's like very, I'm assuming from what I've heard about you, very biblically based and understands the Bible very well, and is new to these ideas. Like given it new to the application of the ideas, right?
Yeah.
Kind of curious where you're coming from on this. What do you think about everything Jacob just said? And without us all like jumping in on him and being like, but this.
Yeah. So here's the thing, guys. I think it's wise to avoid an argument, especially one that doesn't exist. So I'm just trying to figure out if there's even an argument here before I start to, so that's why I'm asking questions, because it'd just be a fruitless argument. We're all going to go home believing what we believe, and but I'd like to try to understand the position better. So specifically, like
except for Will, he doesn't believe in anything.
With Romans 13. That's a good passage. So you brought up a couple of things there. So back to what you'd asked me, what do I think as far as, and I'm sorry, I'm terrible with names.
Jacob.
Raise your hand, Jacob. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So that's Jacob.
Jacob. Hi, Jacob.
And then it's
I'm Will.
Will. Okay.
Derek. And then it's
Eggs.
Eggs.
Will, Derek, eggs.
Yeah, like
what I have for
chicken,
breakfast.
like
okay,
chicken
nice.
food.
like biblical eggs.
Chicken poop. Chicken fetus.
Chicken fetus. All right, so
everybody's favorite breakfast: chicken abortion.
Chicken abortions.
Oh man. So I'd say like I agree with probably about 99% of what you said there, and I'm just leaving the 1% here because there's some questions I've got. I'm not saying I disagree with you.
Yeah, that's fair.
But yeah, so there's Romans 13, and I think Romans 13 is fairly clear. But then you add in your other favorite passage, from what I understand, 1 Peter 2.
Oh, 1 Peter 2, that's kind of like an echoing of Romans 13.
Kind of, but it's from a different perspective, right? Because it says it starts out with, "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be the emperor supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those, et cetera," right? So there you've got something specific where Peter's referencing the emperor as supreme, or is there a different way to understand that from your perspective?
Right. Well, it's important that he says, and I'd have to bring up the context of that passage again. I'm not as familiar with it because it does not come up as much as Romans 13. Mm-hmm. But there's also so there's two angles that need to be, I think, brought up here. One is obviously there's a difference between being subject to and obedience to, and I think as Christians in a very broad sense, and we see this in like passages like Romans 12, we see this in sort of the example of Jesus himself. We're not called to be a like rebellious, cantankerous, ornery people. We are called to, kind of nobly bear our cross and our suffering and persecution. We're told that we're going to be persecuted for the sake of Christ. And so there are going to be a lot of times where we are in various forms, not even just from the state. It can be persecution from the state, maybe persecution in the workplace, being mocked for our beliefs and our faith and things like that. By our peers. Yeah, which Will does. So, and I think in all of those instances, like if we're in like a like a setting, like a human institution, regardless of what it is, we should be subject to them. But there's always, I think, inherently implied in commands like that, the implication of like up until you're being called to disobey God. Obviously, like a good example of this is...
Oh, yeah, for sure.
A good example of this is actually what I named my old podcast after, which is like in Daniel chapter 3, when Meshach, Radshach, and Abednego, they were in the moment that they were refusing to bow down and worship King Nebuchadnezzar. they were not obeying him, but they were being subject to him. Like, they weren't trying to like violently resist what was going on, but they were saying, like, they listen, like, we will, like, you're gonna throw us in this furnace, okay, God can save us or he won't, but we cannot worship anyone but God. And I think that is, you know, at the heart of what's going on. There's a little bit of that in Romans 13, but I think Romans 13 has other elements at play as well. I think the First Peter passage is.
I just want to jump in here quick. I sorry to cut you off, but
sure.
More questions. Just so you know, I have the benefit of having gone through these arguments extensively. So once you touch on something like that, I don't mean to be rude, but I'm going to interrupt and ask a question that comes back to mind.
Please,
that's fine.
Honor the emperor there in 1 Peter 2:14. So we're talking about. I agree completely there with you. Like, we're to be subject, and I think that I would agree with your definition of that. That doesn't mean that we're to, obey every little jot and tittle from the king's pen or whatever. But there's an extreme that we can go to with that, where we kind of make this distinction and then we just leave it hanging there, like, therefore, anarchy, right? It's kind of how I feel the argument is made. It doesn't really address, okay, what about obedience? And when Peter specifically says, honor the emperor, which we know, honor and obedience, there's a strong correlation between those. You can't have honor without at some level, some form of obedience. Paul makes this connection when he recites the commandment to honor your father and your mother, only he says obey as well. So there's this connection between obedience and honor that I don't think, unless you'd go there, I don't think we can completely get away from. There's some level of obedience, right? Or isn't there?
Well, sure.
Well,
If the obedience doesn't require you to disobey God, or to participate in some sort of sin.
I think that should.
But the empire is not an anarchist state, so the empire could command you to do things that are not unbiblical, but they are not anarchists.
Well,
right. So you could be subject to. Okay. So I think I was going to back up at one point too when we were talking to Brandon. You said something at the beginning, back at the beginning of your first explanation, Jacob, that I wanted to. I think most of the people who listen to us probably understand this concept, but like, if you're people who are thoughtful anarchists, right? As I would say most of us here are, thoughtful anarchists understand that there are going to be governing bodies. It's not like there's not going to be something going on that's governing.
Sure.
things.
Yeah, right. But I think Brandon's pointing out that it specifically calls out to honor the emperor here. Because like in Romans 13, it's vague about, it just says governing authorities.
Empire is not self-governance.
But to the point that we were just making now, bring it up here is what Sam's saying is the governing body, whether it's an emperor or just a community agrees that this is our governing body, could subject you to do something involuntary. Like, this is not of your own volition, but it's technically not a sin either, right? So
Sure,
how do we work out those kinds of details and semantics? Like, practically.
I get the question.
So, for example,
I'll answer the question. I think that we use wisdom in those cases. We have Christian freedom there to obey or to disobey. We know that if it's not a sin, but it violates my personal liberty, well, it's like, I don't want to get up into the weeds too much, but take, for example, there's some people that'll say, it's not actually that the government is not justified in requiring me to have a driver's license and insurance in order to operate a motor vehicle. Okay. But is it worth that battle you're going to go down that road, and you're going to refuse to get a license. You're going to refuse to get insurance. Hey, if that's your prerogative, or that is your prerogative, if that's what you want to do it. But is the battle and the ensuing fight that you're going to have going to be worth it?
Right. I would say from a Christian perspective.
Hold up, wait, real quick. You could be like me and avoid getting tags on your license plate for 2 years, then get pulled over repeatedly, then have your 4-year-old in your car while you're both crying because you went through a family tragedy, and then meet eye contact with the police officer that pulled you over 3 days ago, and then have her flip a Yui, and then you're hiding behind a dumpster in your car with your 4-year-old who has asking you, Daddy, are we hiding from the cops? And I go, yes, while I'm purchasing registration on my phone.
It's crazy. The same thing happened to my dad the other day.
Are you serious?
First of all, we need to shout out David Brady's comment, which is the from the Libertarian Convention when they were debating driver's licenses. What's next? A license to make toast in your own damn toaster? I love that. Great reference. No, so I think the driver's license thing is actually a good example here. That's an area where, I think Christians, we would be called to be subject to the state in that instance, because even if I was could make an argument that the state is like overreaching in terms of what their authority is and what they should be dealing with, that doesn't mean that they're not asking us to do anything sinful in that instance. And I think that we are actually potentially harming our witness if we are to pick that battle to die on. And actually, if we read kind of this whole section here in 1 Peter 2, I think it actually clears some of this up. So it says, be subject to the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good, you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God. Honor
obeying
everyone.
Obeying the state is good.
Well, in certain contexts.
Daniel, Sam, are y'all taking notes? Derek, too? Are y'all taking notes? It's like this is. Have I been tricked into a Bible study?
Welcome.
I've got a question. I just didn't want to jump in.
I'm gonna administer.
Well, let me finish this.
So you just prepare your heart for that, Will. Okay.
No!
let me finish the last 2 lines quick. It says, honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. So it's important there. It says, honor the emperor, but fear God. And then it goes on to talk about servants being subject to their masters, which is something Jesus also said. So I think there's a lot of elements to this 1 Peter passage that are like what I already said, which is about what we do when we are being persecuted or we are maybe in a unfair, unbalanced relationship, and how we're supposed to respond to that. We're called above, as Christians, first and foremost, to always do good. And that is part of how we overcome oppression, how we overcome injustice, and how we serve as a witness for the gospel to those around us is to do good. Think about Joseph when he was sold into slavery by his brothers. He did good in that situation, and because so, was eventually put in a situation where he was able to save Egypt and his entire family. And he could have decided to be a victim. He could have decided to rebel against his slave master and be someone who was difficult to deal with, and just could have been from a very human sense justified in being angry and self-righteous and this isn't fair. And I'm sure he had moments of that, but for the most part, what we are told in the biblical passage of what Joseph dealt with in all those times is that he decided to honor God and to do good in the situation he was in, even when it was unfair, and that God rewarded him for that. So I think, a lot of these passages are, they're dealing with a lot of different themes at once. And so we have to be careful, I think, to not conflate the biblical command for what we do in the face of persecution with what the Bible teaches about governing structures and what legitimate authority looks like. Those are not.
Mhm.
I mean, they're not completely unrelated, but we also have to, make them distinct to some extent. And I think the heart of the First Peter passage is, mostly that, again, an echoing of that sort of like Christian mentality, of not trying to, again, like what did Jesus rebuke Peter for in the garden?
Let me just
When he cut off-
interject real quick. And make a very short, statement that won't be confused
for
with
it.
something that makes like 5 minutes long or something. What if it was? How do we know that there wasn't a comma and that they were talking about like honor the emperor being Satan, comma, fear God?
That's a very good question, Bennett.
Grammatical questions from
Actually, unironically, there are many times in the Old and New Testament where Satan is referred to as the ruler of this world, and that's done by, in the New Testament, Jesus and John, and I think Paul and James too, all in different ways refer to Satan as the ruler of this world. So there's actually there's something to that. But
yeah, it's not outside the realm of possibilities. Highly improbable. I would just say to that point, probably because the people at the time who were the direct recipients of these epistles, these letters, that's how they understood them. By far and by large, the way that we understand the scriptures today comes from them, directly from them. So we're not just reading these first century documents and going, well, based on my 21st century Western worldview, I think these mean such and such, which is also, one of the reasons why we want to jump back into the Greek, but also read the early Christians on why, what they thought of the passages themselves, how they understood them. So to my knowledge, there's no early Christian that thought Peter was possibly talking about Satan in there at all.
no, I would agree with that, but I just, I was just kind of being like, unironically, like there are parts of the Bible that talk about the rulers in the sense of being Satan or under the rule of Satan, but I don't think this passage.
Oh yeah, not to discount what you were saying at all, Jacob. There is
no,
that,
but I agree with you.
Sure.
Yeah, and I agree with you also. Just like we have to be, and I try to be careful in what I do. Because what I don't want to do is eisegesis. I don't want to read from a political. What? I don't want to do. I don't want to read a modern political philosophy into the Bible, and I do want to be faithful to the text and be led by it, not by my own preferences and ideologies. And I think that. I had a second point and I completely lost it. So you can whoever wants to talk now can.
Yeah. So I did have another question. Here's a thing that I've
real quick before you get started.
Oh yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, guys, this has been fun. I'm gonna have to pop off in just a minute. I think y'all are having a deep conversation that's extremely interesting. Me as a shitlord Reddit atheist, I just keep wanting to interject with just like allegedly. That kind of talk, but the main thing me is this radical secularist or whatever is I applaud y'all for all your anarchism or your strive towards that goal or whatever. That's kind of like the whole thing, that whether you're a atheist or Christian, Muslim, all that kind of stuff, if you embrace these kind of like ideas of like we don't have to use the state or some sort of force to push our ideas, we can all sit here and like get into how we see the universe and shit. I think it's cool, but I'm about to pop off, guys. Y'all keep talking about Jesus and everything.
Here's to the marketplace of free ideas.
Rock and roll, brother. Nice to meet you. And guys, I'll see y'all next time, fellas.
Have a good night.
Yeah, bros.
Daniel, what were your thoughts on all this?
Well, I just wanted to take it back to that age-old question, of course, is what do you do when the state or the governing authorities are acting against. So they're using the money that they're taking from the people in taxation, and they're using that in ways that are sinful to fund abortion, to fund. Endless wars. I mean, you can name it. There's the laundry list. So what's the response to that? Taxes. I know there's a passage directed towards it, but just in the context of you talking about the state not necessarily being the governing authority. So what would your answer be to that?
Well, I mean, there's multiple levels to that. I mean, I think taxes are a area where, again, it's kind of like Christians would be called to be subject. But that doesn't mean, being subject to something doesn't mean that it's godly. You know what I mean? You can be subject to something that is clearly a violation of what God's moral ordinances and decrees are. In the same way, like when, I think we would all agree as Christians here that slavery is immoral and against what God's moral decrees are. But that, there are many times where Jesus says, servants, serve your masters well. And I know some of it was not slavery and some of it was indentured servitude, but you get my point. There's always, I think that's a biblical principle we could agree on, that being subject to something doesn't necessarily mean that it is a biblical endorsement of the thing that you are called to be subject to, and that we've already agreed there are limitations to what being subject to that thing can mean. As far as what we can, I think there are ways you can be subject to something and also work to change it, right? Like this is why I'm involved in the Libertarian Party, is because as a Christian, I know that, as a Christian and also as someone who knows history, I know violent revolution just doesn't work, and it isn't what the Bible teaches us to do. We're called to transform the world around us primarily through spreading the gospel, by being salt and light.
Red coat.
Yeah.
I was going to say, except for one, but only one. So that's not a good example to just take one out of history that we happen to have benefited from.
We wrote the history book, so it's all good.
Oh yeah.
The American Revolution is a topic we'd have to do a whole other podcast on, because I have a nuanced view on that. And it's definitely complicated. But
he's an immortal being. He could have let us know what that was like.
Yeah.
But I think, we can advocate against these things while being subject to them. And I think that's something we should absolutely do. I think we can advocate for defunding Planned Parenthood, receive no tax dollars. I think we can advocate for, no more of these senseless wars that waste both taxpayers' money and, more importantly, people's lives. I think we can advocate that the state get entirely out of marriage, and no longer have their fingers in that money pot, so to speak. So, I think that's the way that we should try to do it. Again, I think we should try to influence the world around us, and also I think there's an element to, insofar as people think that they need the state for like a social security net or welfare, things like that, Christians should also try to fight back against that, and can fight back against taxation through decreasing the demand for those state services by, doing the things Jesus told us to do. I mean, Jesus said, that which you've done to the least of these, you've done unto me, caring for the poor, for the widow, for the orphan. That's true religion. And I think if we do a better job, I'm not saying the church doesn't do a good job of this, but the better we can do at that, outward mission in our local communities and stuff, and the more we can take care of one another, the less people are going to feel a need for, this giant welfare state that requires a lot of tax dollars and money printing to create.
Well, the irony of that too is that we would have more to provide people if they weren't taking so much.
But if we defunded Planned Parenthood, where would I get free condoms and Plan B?
From your local church.
As a fake Catholic, I don't believe in condoms. So,
got another question for you. So you've got so here in jumping back and forth now. Sorry to do this to you, but Romans 13.
The 1-2 punch.
Well, and so I'm trying to understand too, because so far, yeah, I don't know if I have an argument.
Well,
I think maybe ultimately I have a problem with the name, if I can say
Right.
that much.
Right.
It's kind of weird, against rulers. Really?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, and it says right there in Romans 13, it uses the term rulers.
It's
And so I
almost as
actually,
bad as Lutheran. But when all of my beliefs suddenly lined up with what the Lutheran Church was teaching, and I'm like, seriously though? No, there's got to be
Yeah.
somebody else out there who believes, teaches, and confesses these things, and there wasn't. So I'm like, well, shoot, I guess I'm not.
I've had so many
Lutheran.
political revelations like that too, where it's just like, I first saw secession, and I was like, I don't like that. And then you like,
almost as bad as the Lutherans, but way better than the Episcopalians. I'll tell you that.
Okay, yeah. I'm just saying the name.
I grew up in an Episcopalian church, so I can tell you some stories.
That explains
Here's the funny thing. It was a charismatic Episcopalian church, so just let your imagination go wild with that one.
the real reason I'm Lutheran is just because we have the best potluck.
I actually like Lutheran
That is true.
services. I like the Lutheran liturgy and a lot of their tradition.
They
But,
have
to go-
tradition.
Yeah.
Are you Catholic though?
No, I'm not.
He's
Okay.
a Calvinist, right?
Fake Catholic. Why did you say
mutt.
fake Catholic?
So
Catholic. Yeah.
it's just like an old like social media Twitter joke. People like I had so many Catholics on my show, and I do have a deep I'm a Protestant who has a deep appreciation for Catholicism. Like I try not to be anti-Catholic,
Yeah.
which
That's
just
why I'm a
means that
Lutheran.
like, right, exactly. You know what I mean? So
Same
you
thing.
get it. You get it.
I'm not against Roman Catholics. I'm just
What about-
protesting some
what about-
excesses, right?
Right.
What about
exactly.
Jews? Just keep going.
What?
Oh my.
So
All
for
right.
me-
So
so
I
I
don't even remember Brandon's question anymore. Oh, rulers. So I think words have different like definitions or like different connotations depending on their use. Like so, there's the idea of like a ruler in a sense of like someone who is ruling over people, right? And then you have like a ruler, like something to measure up against, right? And so, I think, and obviously, I want to be clear here. I don't think that Paul or the people who were reading Paul's letter were reading that and then said, okay, cool, so we're anarchists now. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think that thought really was entering their head so much. And I think that so when we're talking about the idea of rulers, I think that there's obviously what we already talked about, which is like what we do in reverence to the state when we're submitting to it. But I think also, authorities are in many ways a type of ruler, right? In a sense of like they are things that we measure up against. And so like they're the ones who administer the rules. So rulers are in a sense biblical. So then you go, well, anarchy means that the mantra is no rulers. And that is technically true, but the type of ruler that anarchy is really getting at is a tyrannical ruler. And if we were to do a more textbook definition of anarchy, it's not a rejection of authority, it's not a rejection of hierarchy, it's not a rejection of law or governance. It is rather a rejection of unjust or tyrannical authority, hierarchy, governance, etc. And it promotes what would be more like, and although this word has been kind of co-opted by the left, and so I don't like using it, but it's like an egalitarian hierarchy. And what I mean by that is not like that, because it's not like an equal, like we're not socialists, right? But what we believe is that there's an equality of rights in the hierarchy, which gets back to like where my pastor has authority over me, but he can't initiate force against me, and I think that those who are in governing authorities, right, those who are administering, you have a third party arbiter who is helping to handle a dispute over property. They have authority to rule on that property dispute. But what they don't have a right to do is obtain their authority through the initiation of force. Like imagine the difference between a church that is formed by people voluntarily in a community coming together and then looking around and going, okay, we need to either find someone who's qualified to be a pastor and invite them to come here, or find the one amongst us who we think is the most qualified. And, this person, through voluntary market mechanisms becomes the person in authority, versus if someone came in and used varying forms of coercion or threats of violence to be like, you're all going to come to my church and you're all going to give me money.
Yeah.
So it's anarchy is a critique of sort of like the praxis of governments and not a rejection of governance. And to the last thing I'll say is your hang up with the word is well noted. And the reason I call myself a biblical anarchist is not because I'm wedded to the word, because I could also use the word voluntarist or just libertarian or etc. There's two reasons I use it. One, because it's a little provocative. And so it's just it's a good marketing ploy to be like for me to call the podcast I do biblical polycentric governments is just a mouthful, not very catchy, right? So to say biblical anarchy, people are going to go like,
So your very name is a lie. That's what you're trying to tell us.
yeah, exactly. Biblical
Yeah,
anarchy is
I
like people
get
are going to go, wow, okay, that's interesting. I don't know what that means. I want to find out more. But the other thing is like, I do want to be honest, and I don't want to like shy away from what I believe. And it's the element of anarchy that says that there are none among us who have special rights, that no person can own another person, and no one has a claim to someone else's body or to their property. And so like, if it's wrong for me to murder, it's wrong for, again, it doesn't become okay to murder just because you have a badge that says you're a cop, or it doesn't become okay to steal just because you're a tax collector. You know what I mean? So it's that element of what I think, and I think that these are principles that are biblical, that I then go, okay, I think that libertarianism and specifically anarcho-capitalism is the political philosophy that is the most logically consistent to conclude based on biblical principles. But if I have a conversation with someone like you and you're like, hey, I agree with like all these principles, I just don't like the word, I'm not going to die on the hill of like, no, you have to call yourself an anarchist, or you're, or you know what I mean? Like that's not, it's not about it's more about the ideas than it is the label.
Yeah. So another question I had, and I've heard this come up before, and I heard you mention it earlier tonight, was legitimate authority. So
Yeah.
I'll be honest, that's probably one of the biggest hangups I've got with what I've learned so far about what we'll just refer to it as biblical anarchy. Here's my problem with biblical anarchy. Since you've shared a little bit, I'll wax eloquent for a second here. Some people obviously probably run into this, go, anarchist, chaos, disorder. They automatically jump to that. Now I'm an etymologist, I linguist, Latin. I understand.
Yeah.
But even for me, I jump immediately to and against, ruler, or our ruler.
Rothbard referred to it as anarcho-capitalist, if that helps you any.
Not really. But yeah, I mean, so even for me, it's like, okay, I know what it means. It just doesn't compute, especially when the word biblical is attached to it. Now, the way that you have explained it, I get that. I've done things for the for lack of a better term, the shock value of something, like, hey, catch their attention, right? And then they look into it more. So I totally get that. One of the things that I just mentioned it earlier was legitimate authority. I guess here's one of the issues I would take with that, which is where we're here in Romans 13. Does it say that? I'm sorry. Oh yeah, verse 1. Okay. Where he says, "For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." I guess the way that I understand that is whether this ruler or this authority is using their authority, their power, for good or for evil. The authority itself comes from God. And so I guess maybe you could explain to me what you mean by legitimate, and do you mean to suggest that there are authorities that are illegitimate in the sense that I'm jumping to conclusions here, forgive me if I am, if I'm misrepresenting the position at all. I don't intend to, but I'm asking questions. It's an exploration. So are you intending to suggest that by illegitimate you mean they're not actually from God?
Right. So this gets a little complex. There are, and I think you probably heard this before. There are different, I think that God has not competing in the sense of like they are at odds with each other, but they're at play at the same time. God has different decrees and wills that are at play. And so one of those decrees and wills is God's sovereign decree, in the sense that like God is sovereign over all of creation and over all of history, everything that has happened, everything that will happen. And so things don't happen by accident. And so, those who come into positions of power, they didn't do so, and God goes like, "Oh wow, I wasn't expecting that." God, everything that happens, even the evil actions of men, God is sovereign over, and he is working all things to the counsel of his will for our good and to his glory. And so that is not something that I could go against without going against a large portion of Scripture. At the same time, then there's also God's moral decree. And so there is like what God has prescribed to us as humans in terms of how we are to live and what is good and bad conduct. And so when I'm talking about legitimate authority, I am speaking more to the moral decrees of God and what is morally prescribed in the Scriptures. Now, what you're getting at, which is a fair objection, is if Romans 13 is prescribing this, everyone be subject to the governing authorities and there's no authority except from God, am I saying that those who rise to state authority are not from God? And I think that, again, this comes down to how we read Romans 13. And so if we read it like, again, in some, just kind of like going down through it here, it says that every person be subject to the governing authorities. Paul is kind of putting a caveat, like there's no authority except from God. Those that exist have been instituted by God, and whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who will resist will incur judgment. We've already agreed there are obvious limitations to that when it comes to the state.
Yep.
And then the third verse, for rulers are not a terror to good conduct but to bad, and that, these authorities that God is talking about are his servant for your good. They're not a terror to those who do good, but rather to those who do evil. So I think what Romans 13 is talking about here is not so much Paul describing the state, what we would define the state as. I think what is really the heart of what's being talked about here is the necessity for the role of civil governance. And again, I think that we have to find, we basically have to start by defining in the context of Romans 13, what is the acousia, what is the hyperacousia that Paul talks about at the beginning. And if we insert that means the state, the passage is now in conflict with itself, and I think a lot of the other parts of the Bible. If it's about governments and authority more generalized and about civil governance and authority, then that reconciles the passage, and I think that also would work. And at the same time, we always have to recognize the interplay between, like I said at the beginning, God's sovereign decree and his moral decrees. And there are times, like, would we tell Oscar Schindler that you were rebelling against God when you were rescuing those Jews from the extermination camps? Like, I don't think you would say that. You know what I mean? So but
Yeah. So, and that's,
Well, I want you to go, and then we'll have Derek jump in too. But
yeah, I think,
We just want to say that we didn't know his first name was Oscar.
who?
Oscar Schindler.
I thought you were going to talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but yeah.
yeah. So
Well,
I haven't heard you say explicitly that. Well, maybe you did mention it. Is the state excluded from this?
I think that the state. So, and to define the state, I think the state is a institution of people, because and that these people in this institution, they seize authority through the claiming a monopoly via the coercion and the threat of initiatory force in a particular geographic area. So I think they are illegitimately claiming authority. Now, once they have that authority, even though that authority has been illegitimately claimed, they can sometimes use that authority in legitimate ways. Like, I'm not out there protesting when police stop a mass shooter, although sometimes they are too cowardly to do so. But the ones who are doing their jobs and that have bravely gone into the fray to stop a mass shooter, they are acting in ways that are legitimate exercises of authority. Or let's say when a judge rules that someone has committed fraud or broken contract or stolen from someone, and that they have to pay restitution to the person that they did that violation of property rights against. That's a legitimate use of that authority. So there are, I guess to summarize, there are legitimate and illegitimate ways to obtain authority, and then there are legitimate and illegitimate ways to use authority. And the state is an institution that I think illegitimately obtains authority, but that can still sometimes use that authority in ways that would be morally legitimate.
Well, let me ask you guys this: should stoning be brought back?
Absolutely.
I would say for pedophiles it could be brought back, although I'm partial to the wood chipper method.
Would you
light stoning?
What
level of stoning would you prescribe? And as a libertarian, would it be just
42?
I think medium.
I think
rare.
I think
420.
I think that
420.
stones in the
medium rare 420.
Medium
I
rare
think
420.
I think stones that are in like the 5.56 diameter range would be appropriate.
There you go,
boys.
At what point is it like a boulder?
So I think that this is what's happening in the podcast is different than what I expected. It's kind of interesting to watch Brandon's asking the questions and then Jacob's answering them thoroughly. And when I came in here, I was like, I want to pick Brandon's brain, but Brandon's fascinated with this explanation. You know what I mean?
And he kind of prefaced that. I think it's because, the relatively new application of these ideas as it relates to anarchy.
Yep.
Like we talked about he recently just within the last month, if I remember correctly, started looking into these applications of these ideas.
Yeah.
So it makes sense.
Yeah. Well, then I wanted to jump back too on something that was said earlier, if you guys don't mind. There was this thing with that Sam said. So Sam, I find your little things that you're piping in every once in a while kind of interesting because you say them a little bit passively, but I went down and agnostic, atheist, back to agnostic, back to faith journey, right?
Mhm.
Things that you're kind of implicating, or the things that you're saying, have deep atheist implications. And maybe you're not intending it that way, but things, for example, being like, you said something like, but we're not saying that the Bible, blah, blah, blah. We're saying it's absolutely true. Or we're saying,
Right. Well, when you said the Bible was progressive for its time, it's like, well, that's not good enough. Like the Bible has to be absolute correct. It's solo scriptura, what we base our faith off of. So, it's not, it should be the pinnacle of morality in the sense, because
it is the pinnacle of morality.
But my question to you, Sam, is it has to be for what? It has to be for what? Because you said it has to be. But finish the sentence. It has to be.
In order for the faith to be logical.
So it has to be for the faith to be logical, is what you're saying?
Yeah, it has to be the truth. If it's not the truth, then all bets are off.
I think that I believe, and this is contrary to popular opinion, but I actually think that the Bible and the history of it and the thinking behind it and all of that stuff actually wins in the intellectual arena. And I think that popular belief is that no, actually the reason and the logic of atheism wins in the arena of like philosophy and intellect. I personally have gone down that road far enough to where if you go down far enough, you just basically get into the roots of evolution, right? Like, because this is skipping a lot of the conversation to get there, right? But you get into the roots of evolution, and then once you follow that back up the ladder, you get. Come on, dude, hold it up. Sorry, we have
we haven't. Never mind.
It's a small. We're paying a small Asian person to hold this
entire time.
But anyways, if you follow it,
as long as the empire is okay with that, then it's biblical.
As long as he's serving,
faith is a gift, and Sam doesn't have it, so he's obviously going to hell.
Oh my gosh.
No, so I was predestined, so it doesn't really matter what I do. So, but continue.
Exactly.
Hey guys, I'm gonna have to go in like 5 minutes. So,
oh, dang it.
We are getting on the top of the, pop off whenever you need to, Jacob. Thanks for joining, and I put links to your website below, and also you can do your plugs quick if you want.
Yeah, I mean, I'll hang around for a few more minutes. If anyone wanted to ask a couple last questions or comments. But biblicalanarchypodcast.com. Follow me at Biblical Anarchy on Twitter, and the podcast is Biblical Anarchy Podcast. It's on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, bunch of random podcast apps I didn't know even existed, and things like that. So, and I'm having, not having, because I don't do live anymore, so it's confusing. I used to do a live show, now I don't. But I recorded an episode with Dave Smith, which will be airing next Wednesday.
Nice.
So definitely check that out.
Nice.
You called him a coward, and it worked, right?
No, worse. I called him Ben Shapiro.
Probably the same difference.
Yeah, I think it's worse. But anyway, Derek, I don't know where you were, if you were done with your point or not.
Oh no, it would take me forever to actually follow the train of thought all the way down and back up. But basically saying that everything, people look at the Bible and they say everything has to work out perfectly logically, or else none of it's true, right? And I could go on and on about the arguments against that, but one of them is logic according to who? To you?
Yeah, I mean that's
To
part
you,
of the
then
problem
it's
is that's the problem of reading the Bible in a 21st century lens and not understanding a lot of the literary styles and the understandings of history and science by the people who wrote the Bible, they didn't have the same, worldview and styles of those things that we have. I mean, for example, the book of Judges, among other books in the Bible, aren't always written in perfect chronological order in terms of the events that happened. And so, to us, some people will make the counter argument and be like, no, everything that is in the Bible must be strictly science. So, that's how you get young earth creationists, and they will, so I've just opened up like 50 different cans of worms here. But my point just being that there are, I think that we have to be careful because it's tough. Because like I believe in the infallibility of Scripture. I believe in the inerrancy of Scripture. But we also have to understand that like the Bible is not like one book written by one author. It is God's word, but it's God's word that came through different authors who wrote for different specific reasons in different contexts and in different literary forms. So we have to, that's why you have hermeneutics and biblical exegesis, because you have to study the text in its original language, in its original context, and take all these things into consideration to try to get to the best understanding of what the actual meaning of those texts are. And I think what the texts teach is inerrant. But that doesn't mean that the certain the details that might be like, some people might go like, well, that's not scientifically true. It's like, well, the Bible's not teaching scientific truths as a primary thing. So that's not a good objection to the truth of the Bible. The other thing to what Sam was saying, as far as like the Bible needing to be the pinnacle of morality, but then like so it's not good enough just to say that this was progressive for the time, which kind of triggered me because I think that Jesus says that God allowed divorce because of the wickedness of our hearts. So I think it's clear that divorce isn't obviously the only thing God must have allowed because of the wickedness of our hearts. There's a lot of things like slavery, like having to like, hey, I can't just tell these people don't keep slaves and don't stone people. He's like, I have to find creative ways to write the law to restrain the evil of these people and to advance moral development in these people, and to also point them towards their eventual need for a savior because they can't live up to the law. And so there's a lot of things going on at play at once there, but one of them is God, saying that he has to write the law in a way that limits evil, but that obviously like he has to allow some of that evil to come through because he knows we're going to fall short.
Interesting. Yeah, I never thought of it that way before. So do you think God's just being politically smart? He's not saying slavery's illegal because he knows if he says slavery's illegal, they'll still have slaves and they'll be treated even worse. So he's being strategic and just saying
yes,
it's legal, but you have to treat them this certain way.
Yeah, and he's creating God put in the Old Testament law and in the New Testament things about that pertain to human dignity and about slavery that eventually led Christian abolitionists to call for the end of slavery. So there are things in the Bible that lead to the opposition to slavery, and it was like the idea that slaves are people and you can't just kill them or just beat them arbitrarily. And heck, there was even provisions in the Old Testament for the slaves and people's debts being wiped clean and being freed and stuff. So there's a lot in there that that goes that your Reddit atheist will ignores when they're talking about slavery in the Bible, amongst other things that they consider to be barbaric. It's like, I mean, it's barbaric from our 21st century point of view. The fact that it was progressive for the time, I think, is evidence of its divine inspiration. Because,
well, do you think there's a hierarchy of morals that he prescribes? So, like, if you say, the golden rule plus slavery, the golden rule outranks slavery, and we can sort of use some of the more clear or avoid more of the law and follow more of the understanding. That makes sense. So
I think you can look at the heart of the law. You can understand that the law was written to the Israelites who lived in a particular time and place, and it was written primarily for them. And there's also divisions in the law. You have ecclesiastical law, ceremonial law, civil laws, and then the moral laws. The moral laws apply to us today as they did back then. But the other ones, although they might not apply to us, there are lessons we can glean from them, and they are certainly, I think, even in things that we, I think the example that Derek brought up earlier was fantastic about the stoning and how that was an advancement in like political structures. You know what I mean? That was like saying like, hey, like that leads. That's kind of like a what's the word here? Like a
let me ask you-
foreshadowing of like later where it says, "Don't take vengeance into your own hands."
Do you think there's some things lost in translation because the Bible was written by people? Do you think God's speaking to the people and the people putting it out there? Do you think there is?
I don't. That's what makes me an inerrantist, because like that's one of the primary things that distinguishes biblical inerrancy from those who believe that the Bible is just divinely inspired but fallible. I think that we are fallible, and so our interpretations of Scripture can fall short. And I think that there can be some things lost in translation in terms of, like translating it from Hebrew and Greek to English, and just being 2,000 or more years separated from the times that these were written. But I don't think that like they wrote things down wrong, or at least to put it this way, we can track through history the manuscripts that we have, and we'll see at times where people write things down wrong, but they're like 99% like they put a comma in a different place, or they misspelled something by accident, they smudged a word, or they said things,
or they wrote it in NIV instead of King James.
Right, exactly. Or like a common example is like, like you can, the structure of sentences. It could be like, Sam and I went to town, or it could be like, we went to town, Sam and I. You know what I mean? Like it's the same thing but said in different ways. So like, there's some people who go out there and go, there's like 500,000 different errors and contradictions in the Bible, and it's like, yeah, like 99.9% of them are just like little things like that.
There's never been a book written by so many authors over such a different expanse of time in so many languages. The fact that it has as many correlations and things that affirm it is the crazy part. It's not the part that there's so many different like errors. It's like the fact that it actually ties together in as many ways as it does is insane. It's like you can't you could attempt to explain it without believing in divinity or some kind of spirit, right? But but that argument wouldn't make sense.
You also have more evidence.
The correlations and the way that it connects in different ways. That's the amazing part, not the amount.
It can't just be amazing; it has to be perfect.
But why is that though? That's what I'm trying to get with you, Sam. Is like, what is it?
Perfect. That would be the question, because we,
and
that's one thing in the English language. We look at for example, Greek, where it says perfect when the perfect will come. Be perfect as your heavenly Father, or as your Father in heaven is perfect. The Greek there is tetelestai, which means complete, paid in full. Like right. So it's like
the same thing Jesus says on the cross.
so complete could be very different from perfect in English. It's.
So do you think that God speaking to humans and humans writing it down, that we are reading a human book in that sense? So like, are we reading the human translation of what God said to someone, or is it God speaking through humans?
It'd be very similar to, I'd say it is the word of God, right? And the word became flesh and he walked amongst us. He's man, 100% divine. So he has the human nature, the divine nature, not half and half, but fully God, fully man. In the same way, the Bible is a fully human. It's been authored by fully human authors who were fully inspired by God, and I don't know how all that works. I'm still trying to work out how Jesus was both God and man, but that's what I think of. It's like it's yes,
yeah, both in with an under, right?
Brandon will probably appreciate.
I got to interject with where I get fascinated with the Catholic faith, and some of the things that drew me to that is they accepted.
I gotta actually interact, or no, keep going.
You got an erection? What?
I meant to say interject, and I was just going to say
Man.
something dumb. Banana. Anyway, go, Derek.
I think we're along 2 hours in. Maybe I could finish a sentence. We'll see how this goes.
Zero chance.
Sam just ends the stream right now.
Yeah.
That would be so funny.
I do have to pay extra if it goes over 2
Apparently
hours. So.
we can't end because Forrest Mommy just opened another beer.
Okay, we got to go another.
All right,
12
we got to
minutes.
keep going. We got to keep going.
So
for the sparklers.
Yeah, for the sparklers.
For the sparklers.
So
I thought it was like a bottle rocket.
oh, fuck. That doesn't matter.
All right. Well, everyone, thank you for joining the Black Flag Podcast. We are ending it, and we will see you again on the other side.